Good morning, good afternoon, depending on what part of the world you're joining us from. My name is David Patterson. I am a senior research fellow with ISGAP, the Institute for the Study of Global Anti-Semitism and Policy. Today we have yet another webinar in the series on intersectionality and anti-Semitism throughout the world. It's a series that examines interconnections, manifestations, parallels, and bonds. Today, we're going to hear from Dr. Ansel Brown about common experiences and bonds between the African and Jewish diasporas. It's an honor for me to introduce Dr. Brown, a good friend, a colleague, someone from whom I've learned a great deal. Professor Brown is an associate professor at North Carolina Central University School of Law. Teaches civil procedure, legal research and writing, as well as a writing seminar in international law. His research focus is international law and Pan-Africanism. Professor Brown is also president of the Africa-Israel Chamber of Commerce, Americas. Prior to academia, Professor Brown served as policy counsel at both the North Carolina Institute of Minority Economic Development and the Center for Responsible Lending. Professor Brown earned his bachelor's degree from NCCU and his Juris Doctor from Harvard Law School. As a law student, he's co-founded the Alliance for Israel. He wrote his third-year paper critiquing the Durham Conference on Race, Discrimination, and Xenophobia, and he received the Dean of Students Community Leadership Award. Professor Brown is a member of the North Carolina State Bar, and he is also an ISGAP Research Fellow. So it's my honor to welcome Dr. Brown, to welcome all of you here, and please go ahead, Professor Brown.
Well, great. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Patterson, for that kind introduction. It's always such a delight to be with you and to be amongst our family and friends in the ISGAP community around the world. And so there's quite a bit to share on the parallels between racism and anti-Semitism. And what I would like to do as I begin is just to share my screen, if I may. Okay. There's quite a bit, as I indicated, to engage, but what I would like to address today as a lead into our discussion is one of the troubling manifestations of contemporary anti-Semitism that we have witnessed over the past several decades, and that has been a concerted effort to delegitimize the Jewish homeland of Israel. Now, while this might seem to some to be the most controversial and debatable characterization of anti-Semitism, after all, Israel is not above reproach and certainly has great room for growth in the area of justice, as is the case of nearly all nations. But the delegitimization of Israel as the Jewish homeland is a wholly different matter of prejudice and bigotry that escapes the bounds of valid critique and accountability. To be specific, the characterization of Israel in its essence as a colonial racist occupying state is indeed tantamount to defaming the Jewish collective as evil and undesirable, and thus a preferred candidate for downgrade or elimination. The land of Israel indeed gave birth to the Jewish people as a distinctive group. Israel is the mother, and to deny one's connection to his or her mother is to deny that person's very existence. This is why we all intrinsically take the deepest offense to anything that would slander or harm our mother, because she is the fountain of life and nurture to which we owe our greatest respects and honor. So to deny the Jewish motherland is to fundamentally deny the Jewish right to exist as a people. And it is the precursor of genocidal anti-Semitism that has reared its ugly, venomous head time and time again throughout the ages. And this recurring horror is one that the African, both in the continent and in the diaspora, knows all too well. During the 20th century, we witnessed a unique, monumental, and seismic shift in history. Africans and Jews were both the serial victims of ethnic marginalization, demonization, subjugation, and dehumanization, oftentimes culminating in the most heinous crimes against humanity. Of particular import, and to the point that I've raised, this oppression was rooted in a common experience of alienation from our sovereign homelands and fueled by a consistent psychology of oppression. But in a reversal of fate, and in the face of the most dire circumstances, both Africans and Jews resiliently regained our rightful place in the world stage. For Jewish communities, they emerged from 2,000 years of exile, inquisitions, expulsions, pogroms, and genocidal anti-Semitism to be reestablished as a sovereign people in the state of Israel. For African communities, we emerged from centuries of slavery, colonialism, segregation, lynchings, and institutional racism to be reestablished as liberated peoples in the continent of Africa and in the diaspora. And while the similarities of sufferings and parallel movements of self-determination for Africans and Jews is profound, closer examination reveals that this is not coincidental. Africans and Jews have deep and connected roots with common bonds of peoplehood and faith, common trials of homeland and diaspora, and common lessons of subjugation and sovereignty. So I want to talk about the common bonds of peoplehood and faith. There is an ancient bond between Africans and Jews that goes back millennia. And this interconnectivity is quite natural given the proximity of Africa and Israel, geographically, culturally, sociologically, and politically. Take, for instance, the Jewish Torah, which has served for centuries as the constitution of Jewish identity. Now, I recognize that there are varying levels of veracity that we attribute to the Torah and other religious books, but we must give credence to this ancient and sacred book as an authentic, at minimum, as an authentic and rightful expression of Jewish self-identity. And so the traditional and self-identified author of the Torah, Moses, was himself raised as an African in the house of the African Egyptian Pharaoh. And being raised as an African, he was married to an African Ethiopian wife. He led Israel out of Africa or Egypt with a mixed company of Africans to be reestablished or to be initially established as a nation in the land of African Canaanites. So Jewish tradition essentially suggests that the Jewish nation is birthed out of Africa as it is birthed out of Israel. And the great Jewish prophets and sages recognize this deep connection between Israel and Africa. In the Jewish prophetic writing of the prophet Amos, in chapter 9, verse 7, it reads, "And you, or are you not as the sons of Ethiopia to me, O sons of Israel, declares the Lord? Have I not brought up Israel from the land of Egypt, and the Philistines from Caphtor, and the Arameans from Ker?" And so you see this connection, even in the Jewish prophets, identifying Israel with the peoples of Ethiopia, and Africa, and Egypt. In Isaiah, chapter 19, verses 25, it reads, "Whom the Lord of hosts has blessed, saying, blessed is Egypt, my people, and Assyria, the work of my hands, and Israel, my inheritance." Just before the people of Israel were taken into the second captivity by the Babylonians, the first being the Assyrians, just as the Babylonians had laid siege to Jerusalem, the Jewish prophet, according to the writings of the Tanakh, the Jewish prophet Jeremiah was warning the people that imminent doom ensued, which didn't go over so well. And he found himself thrown into a cistern. And it was an Ethiopian eunuch who came to the rescue and solace of Jeremiah. So in this exile that unfolded with the Babylonian exile, we see many African Jewish communities that emerged. There are well over 500,000 North African Jews, 250,000 Ethiopian Jews, 200,000 Jews of Southern Africa, including 80,000 Limba, and 100,000 Ashkenazi South African Jews. And then there are other Jewish communities in Africa, such as the Igbo in Nigeria, the House of Israel in Ghana, and other communities throughout the continent. Today, there are over 100,000 Jews of African ancestry in North America. In fact, the African diaspora in America was deeply inspired by the Jewish experience. African Americans were inspired by the Jewish story of freedom to reach the promised land, the deep Negro spirituals that inspired and sustained our people, such as Go Down Moses and Joshua Fought the Battle of Jericho. These were all inspired by the Jewish story of liberation. African American churches often took the names of sites in the Jewish scriptures, such as Mount Nebo, Mount Moriah, and Mount Zion. Speaking of Zion, in reggae music, in the West Indian diaspora, African diaspora, we see these same connections and inspirations from the Jewish story. By the Rivers of Babylon alludes to the story of the Jewish exiles in Babylon, longing of returning to the motherland of Israel. And of course, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. himself was deeply inspired by the Jewish story. His sermon, Let Justice Roll, was inspired by the words of the prophet Amos. His I Have a Dream speech evoked the words of the prophet Isaiah in Isaiah chapter 40, verses 4 and 5. And we all know of the well-documented relationship between Dr. King and Rabbi Abraham Heschel and the Jewish freedom fighters who stood side by side with the African-American community in Mississippi and Alabama, even spilling their blood alongside our community in the civil rights movement. And it wasn't only a one-way street of inspiration and support. The Black liberation movement inspired the Jewish liberation movement. Modern Zionism got a breath of life here in America, inspired by Black liberation and the Back to Africa movement. When the Jewish community in America saw African Americans standing proudly in solidarity with the continent of Africa, it inspired the Jewish community to likewise stand up and vocally assert their connection to the Jewish homeland of Israel. As you might imagine, there was some trepidation coming out of the Holocaust with being so vocal in this sort of identity. And this was inspired by the African American Black liberation and Back to Africa movement. Speaking of the Holocaust, when Jewish scholars were kicked out of academic institutions in Europe, in Germany to be precise, it was not the Harvards and Yales and Princetons and Columbias that welcomed them. It was historically Black colleges and universities where Jewish scholars were given the opportunity to teach, because at the most recognized today institutions, Jews were not allowed to actually teach. And we see that Africans and Jews have deep bonds that are strong and enduring. However, and unfortunately, Africans and Jews have also experienced the same types of tragedies in our homelands and in exile from our homelands. And there's a saying that what happens to the Jews never ends with the Jews. And this is no more true than in the case of the African and African diaspora experience. We have seen time and time again that the tragedies and the oppressions and the injustices that have overtaken the Jewish community have eventually made their way to our community. And that is why it's so important that we stand in solidarity with the Jewish community in the fight against contemporary anti-Semitism, even as the Jewish community stands in solidarity with the African and African diaspora community against racism and neocolonialism. So for example, If we look to, we're just coming out of the Hanukkah holiday season. And the historical context of Hanukkah was that in 175 BCE, the Greek leader Antiochus IV Epiphanes went into the Jewish homeland once the Jewish people had begun to regather back in Israel from the exile to Babylon, and they imposed Greek European cultural subjugation upon the people. And they defiled Jewish customs and heritage and culture. And then we saw the Maccabees, led by Judah Maccabee, rise up to throw off the bonds of Greek European oppression. Well, what did we see in Africa, making its way to Africa with colonialism, the imposition of European languages and culture in a way that was condescending and in a way that undermined the integrity of African language, African culture, African identity. After the Greeks, the Romans came in and occupied the Jewish people in their homeland. And when the Jewish people revolted against Roman occupation, what did the Romans do, being masters of psychological warfare? They went in, they defeated the Jewish revolt, they sacked Jerusalem, they burned it, they destroyed the Jewish temple, the Jewish place of worship, and they renamed the land of Israel, Judea and Samaria, to the name of the ancient arch rival and enemy of the Jewish people, Palestine. What do we see? Again, fast forward to what happened in Africa when the Europeans came into Africa. In 1884, with the Berlin Conference, they carved up Africa and they subjugated Africa. They occupied Africa. And they went into places like the Great Zimbabwe, and they psychologically attempted to dominate Africa by renaming African civilizations and places such as Zimbabwe to Rhodesia after one of the most notorious colonialists, Cecil Rhodes. Fast forward to 636 CE, when Arab invaders came in and dispelled the Jewish majority from the Jewish homeland. Mind you, there has been a continuous connection and presence of Jewish people from the days of the Roman occupation until the present in the homeland, but the Arab invaders came in and dispelled the Jewish majority from the land of Israel. Well, fast forward again. In Africa, 80 million Africans were taken in the Arab slave trade, something that is not often talked about. And we don't see the repercussions of that because many of the male Africans who were taken were emasculated, and the women were taken as sex slaves. So we don't see the phenotype that lingers in the population as we see today as a result of the European slave trade. In the Jewish diasporic experience from the 1000s up until the 1800s, the Jewish community experienced marginalization economically, demonization in Europe, oppression, vile depictions of Jewish features. And what did we see in the African diasporic experience? The same thing, ghettos, being demonized, being depicted with our African features in the most dehumanizing manner. In the 1800s, the Jewish community finally began to gather some steam to resist this oppression and look back to the motherland with the leaders of modern Zionism, such as Theodor Herzl and others, who actually inspired the fathers of Pan-Africanists, such as Delaney and Blyden, Garvey, Du Bois, and Nkrumah. And by the way, there's a quote that I like to share that Theodor Herzl, if I can go to it here, that Theodor Herzl is quoted from one of his books. And it says, this is the father of modern Zionism. And these are his words and how he connected the Jewish experience to that of the African diasporic experience. He said, there's still one problem of racial misfortune unresolved, The depths of that problem and all their horror only a Jew can fathom. I mean the African problem. Think of the hair-raising horrors of the slave trade. Human beings, because their skins are black, are stolen, carried off, and sold. Now that I've lived to see the restoration of the Jews, I should like to pave the way for the restoration of the African. This is Theodor Herzl, the father of Zionism. And so there are some common lessons of subjugation and sovereignty that we can draw from our common experiences. And then I want to talk about some challenges and some opportunities that I see for walking together in solidarity. What we have experienced is that the compromised sovereignty of a group's homeland as a haven of communal identity, security, and self-realization can lead to devastating injustices. And that is why it's imperative for both the Jewish and the African community to stand in solidarity against the delegitimization of our homelands. The second lesson is that groups under jurisdiction of legal systems, domestically or internationally, must participate both in the formulation and implementation of the systems in order to fully realize social justice. We have seen in the case of both Jews and Africans an intentional crippling of national sovereignty and participatory justice that led to some serious ramifications, culminating in Europe with the Inquisitions and ultimately the Holocaust. Here in America with the African American community, in the 1787 Constitutional Convention, where slavery was given a green light. And African Americans were counted as 3/5 of a person for political reasons here in America, but we had no place. We had no participatory role in these decisions. In 1896, the notorious Plessy versus Ferguson decision, where segregation was blessed by the Supreme Court of the United States, the Supreme Court of jurors who were all white male justices, no representation by the African American community on the bench at that time. In 1884, the Berlin Conference, which I referenced, when European colonial powers went in and plotted how they would carve up and dominate the continent of Africa, the repercussions of which we still see today in the form of neocolonialism, which I'll talk about in a moment. And then I could go on, I could talk about the Bretton Woods agreements or entities, the International Criminal Court, the United Nations Security Council, which have minimal, if no permanent African presence to protect the interests of Africans in the continent and in the diaspora. And we are seeing, this is an important point I want to raise, particularly as it relates to the African community and the sons and daughters of Africa. We are seeing efforts today to roll back the tide of African sovereignty, self-determination, independence, and prosperity with neo-colonial efforts to destabilize the nation of Ethiopia. With Western media and leaders seeking to undermine the democratically elected government of Abiy Ahmed, while placating to terrorist and totalitarian entities such as the TPLF, which has sought to utilize many of the same tactics we see amongst Palestinian terrorist organizations to commit human rights violations, such as using human shields and child combatants, provoking a response from the democratic government of Ethiopia, and then soliciting a response from the West to delegitimize Ethiopia. And all of this has been to destabilize Ethiopia for the benefit of Egypt, who does not want to see Ethiopia develop a dam on Ethiopia's own Nile River waters for the benefit and self-sufficiency of Africans. And so I encourage our friends in the Jewish community to stand against what the West is doing in Ethiopia, which is very much parallel to what has happened in Western BDS circles to pander to terrorists and delegitimize the state of Israel. The third lesson, as I'm bringing this down the stretch, is that Africans and Jews have historically drawn strength from our common bonds as our destinies seem inextricably linked. Now, with that said, there is a future of hope. African and Jewish values, faith, culture, and ingenuity have made immeasurable contribution to humanity. The potential for a strategic alliance between Africans and Jews politically, economically, and culturally could have historic repercussions for both our communities as well as for the world at large. And you can see that Dr. King also sort of drew from this inspiration. And I'm going to come back to the words of Dr. King in conclusion, but what I would like to point out briefly are some challenges to this solidarity that I see. Well, one challenge is the persistence of global racism and anti-Semitism. Another challenge is the economic ramifications of institutional racism, neocolonialism, which I just alluded to, that we're seeing in Ethiopia and also West Africa with the mingling or the tampering that we see with France and West Africa, and also BDS. The third challenge is this homeland disconnection and identity degradation that we see in the Jewish and African diaspora communities. Fourth, there are some misunderstandings, and we must face this. There are real misunderstandings between African and Jewish communities. And then fifth, the lack of knowledge and coordination around our common interest. Now, with that said, I believe there are opportunities for African and Jewish mutual self-realization. We can see grassroots and organized efforts to combat racism and anti-Semitism. I think there are opportunities for economic cooperation in business, agriculture, technology, medicine. Dr. Patterson mentioned that I am the director of the Africa-Israel Chamber of Commerce for the Americas, and we're seeking to reestablish a new triangle between Africa, the African diaspora, and the state of Israel that will be productive and a gift and a blessing, and that will be a counter or the antithesis of what happened with the tragedies of the European slave triangle. Third, cultural immersion, language learning, and summer programs. I believe that there's much for the African diaspora community to draw from and to learn from some programs that we have seen in the Jewish community, such as Birthright Israel. Fourth, faith-based dialogue, cultural exchange, and coordinated community projects. And fifth, institutions to support intellectual scholarship and coordinated initiatives. And what I would like to do is go back just for a moment to the words of Dr. King, which I like to share when I give this presentation, that I believe are very impactful. In Dr. King's final sermon, when he was, and you all have probably heard this, the mountaintop sermon, when he was looking to the future of America and the path forward for the civil rights movement in America, he drew from the story of Moses, who went to the mountaintop outside the land of Israel when Israel was consummated as a nation in the land of Israel just before that. And he drew from the story of Moses, and he shared these words that I would like to share with our community today.
All we say to America is be true to what you said on paper. I lived in China or even Russia or any totalitarian country. Maybe I understand some of these illegal injunctions. Maybe I could understand the certain basic First Amendment privileges because they have committed themselves to that over there. But somewhere I read of the freedom of assembly. Somewhere I read of the freedom of speech. Somewhere I read of the freedom freedom of press. Somewhere I read the greatness of America is the right to protest far right. So that's what I'm saying. Y'all gonna let it dodge a water hose that's turn us around. Y'all gonna let it junction turn us around. Well, I don't know what will happen now. We've got some difficulties ahead. But it really doesn't matter with me now. Because I've been to the mountaintop. Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place. But I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. I've seen the promised land. But I want you to know tonight, we as a people will get to the promised land. So I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. My eyes have seen the glory.
Thank you so much, Dr. Patterson and guests for
So I've got
having
my
me.
essay written, and I've been working on it for about.
And I look forward to taking your questions and continuing this all-important conversation.
Thank you, Dr. Brown. That was amazing, as all of your presentations have been in my experience, and I continue to learn from you, as we all do. We do have a question from the chat. This is from Asher Wexler. Who asks, what is the difference between acknowledging Jewish roots in Africa and the conspiracy that has circulated more fringe groups that Hebrews were in fact Black Africans? Is there any danger here?
Yes, this is an important question. Thank you, Asher, for this question. A very important question. There is a distinction because the former would have been legitimized Jewish communities in Africa. Again, those that I mentioned in the Horn of Africa, in Southern Africa, in West Africa, that are a part of the larger Jewish fabric and has embraced its place in the larger Jewish fabric and tapestry, whereas the latter movement that you alluded to is another form of replacement theology, whereby you have fringe groups who are asserting that they are the true Israel, the new Israel, and that is in fact dangerous. And I believe we should reject these sorts of sentiments. Those are toxic to Jewish and African relations. They're toxic to the Jewish community. They're toxic to the African diaspora community. With that said, though, there are legitimate African communities, and I believe that we should embrace those and celebrate those as a part of the larger Jewish tapestry. Thank you for that question. Very important question.
Could I offer 2 points? When Constantine took over, what was, hang on, sorry. Yeah, when Constantine converted to Christianity, I think it was about 312 in the Common Era. About 315, he issued that everyone should become Christian. In 1493, Alexander VI, Pope, issued the doctrine of discovery, which says if you discover a land that is not Christian, you're supposed to take possession of it and convert everyone to Christianity, which is, if you will, the antithesis of colonialism that has hit the North American natives, Africa, and God knows where else, Australia, etc. Your thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. As I understand the question, it seems as though you're referencing some of the more traditional forms of anti-Semitism. Is that correct? From a Christian standpoint?
It served for anti-Semitism, yes. It served for anti-everybody else.
Yes, absolutely. Yes, well, unfortunately and tragically, the history of Christianity, institutional Christianity, is certainly replete with distortions and perversions of what is actually in the text of the Christian Bible. Yep. And the way that it was advanced within parts of the world, the way that it was used as a sword against the Jewish community, is certainly a tragedy of ironies, in that the followers of Jesus were themselves Jewish, and certainly did not espouse many of the tactics and the beliefs that had been promulgated in the name of Christianity. So this has absolutely been problematic. It was problematic in Africa, with many missionaries exploiting Africans in the name of Christian advances, which I would posit would be counter to the true intentions of the original followers of Jesus. Thank you for that.
We have a couple of questions in the Q&A function. One requests a transcript of Dr. King.
Yes, let me just,
difficult.
If I can, I'm just going to post.
That speech is easily found on the internet.
Yes, I just posted it in the live chat, the YouTube video.
Yeah.
And
the link, then I'm sure that we can get those who want to listen to it will get a better sound quality.
Yes.
And I think it's important to note that that speech was given at the Mason Temple in a church, in the Kojic Church in Memphis, the Church of God in Christ Church. So as you know, and Dr. King said, I just want to do God's will, right?
Absolutely.
And that's I think, fundamental to the kinds of connections and parallels that you, Dr. Brown, have drawn here. Robin Gottlieb has a question. Thanks for the presentation. I'd not been aware of TPLF. Has the US government had difficulty understanding that terrorist groups can, unfortunately, be part of governments such as Hezbollah?
Well, unfortunately, they have. Unfortunately, I have to say that this administration has actually backed the TPLF, or the Tigray People Liberation Front, which, when they were in power in Ethiopia, was a totalitarian dictatorial regime. They stole billions from the people of Ethiopia. And once the people of Ethiopia democratically, in one of the most unprecedented election in Ethiopia, elected the current Prime Minister of Ethiopia, Abiy Ahmed, TPLF went into exile, and they have been stirring an insurgent movement. They have been committing human rights violations. They have been engaging in the destruction of schools and hospitals, ethnic cleansing, mass rape. And the West, much like we have seen in the case of Israel, has largely responded by backing the TPLF and showing sympathy to their tactics, to the dismay and the delegitimization of the government of Ethiopia. It's a very unfortunate situation. And I think it's important to shine light on these events because, again, what begins with Israel does not end with Israel. And we see it happening and replicating in other places around the world where other groups are looking to what's happening in Israel, and they're taking a page right out of the book of what we're seeing in Israel with modern contemporary anti-Semitism.
Yes, Stephen Gerzoff has a question in reference to the doctrine of discovery that you mentioned. Said, was this doctrine of discovery later appropriated by Muhammad for his doctrine of jihad and conversion of conquered peoples and the rest of the whole world to Islam? I mean, jihadism is something that people on the African continent are dealing with as well, as we know.
Yeah, so I'm looking at the question. Interesting. My understanding is that I would say it's the other way around. Muhammad came onto the scene, and I don't want to let me sort of, I don't want to single out a particular religious leader, by the way, or a particular faith. But I will say that Islamist expansionism into Africa, into North Africa, and the taking of African slaves was something that was actually replicated by European explorers, missionaries, and slave traders, unfortunately.
Yeah, well, what about if I have a question or two myself?
Mm-hmm.
You at the beginning of your presentation, you pointed out some common and powerful roots that bind Africans and Jews, namely, scriptures
Mm-hmm.
and references in scriptures, and as we know, that shared religious tradition in many ways brought together Jews and African Americans and things like civil rights movement. You had the famous image of Rabbi Heschel and Dr. King together. Where is God in this? Or what is the religious dimension? How significant is it? How crucial is it?
Well, that's a great question, Dr. Patterson. I know with your both your scholarly and probably your personal background, this is something that is near and dear to you and your work. I believe it's very much at the center of this. As I indicated, the African American liberation movement was fundamentally inspired in our faith and our spiritual tradition by the Jewish story. And I believe it's critical. And by the way, I also mentioned the Ethiopian community. Christianity, or not even Christianity, I should say, but Judaic or Judeo-Christian faith was not introduced to Africans by slave owners and slave traders. Egypt, and specifically Ethiopia, has an ancient biblical foundation. You see Ethiopians, as I alluded, in the Jewish scriptures as well as in the New Testament, an Ethiopian Jewish community. And so Africans have always been deeply connected to Jewish faith, Jewish spiritual experience, and belief in God. And I believe this is very much core to building and forging those ties. And one thing that I will say that I believe that is shared between the African spiritual, I say the African American, I'll be specific, the African American, I would say African as well, faith expression and the Jewish faith expression is this concept of tikkun, this concept of responsibility, not just for myself and my own personal faith conviction, but showing goodness and kindness and, you know, brotherly compassion, sisterly compassion for my neighbor, loving my neighbor as myself. Speaking of God and the Jewish gift to the world, this principle, in my view, is at the heart of most bigotries and hatreds and prejudices, not loving our neighbor as ourselves. This is a gift of the Jewish people to the world. And this is a gift that the African and African diaspora community has always embraced, loving your neighbor as yourself, showing compassion, showing mercy, caring for the fatherless and the widow. So I think the role of faith and God belief is certainly important. It has been, I think it remains important.
Well, excellent point, wonderful point concerning, you know, the commandment to love the neighbor, and the as yourself, the Hebrew kamocha tells us that who we are lies precisely in that loving relation, and maybe perhaps even more powerful is the commandment to love the stranger. We're commanded 36 times concerning the stranger, to care for the stranger, to look out for the stranger. And it's, as Rabbi Jonathan Sachs points out, this is probably the most counterintuitive of the commandments. And maybe that's why it's repeated so frequently. We need to be reminded that that the stranger isn't so strange. I mean, in other words, we're children of God, children of Adam. The Hebrew term for human being is Ben Adam, a child of Adam. We have this common tie. And I think what is one of the many wonderful things that can come out of your presentation and your engagement, our engagement with this, is a deeper understanding of what it means to realize that the stranger isn't so strange, that the stranger is my sister, my brother, my mother, father, child, right?
Right.
But there is, you know, almost naturally, I don't know if it's natural, but there is among many of us a resistance to getting close to what is weird or different or strange to us. That's a big challenge.
You know, it's an important point, Dr. Patterson, and I recognize this is not a discourse in theology, but I will take the bait. There is a text in the Gospels where the Rabbi Jesus was approached by a legal thinker with, what does it mean? You know, how do I uphold the law, the Torah? And he alluded to the Shema, to love the Lord your God with all your heart, your soul, and your strength. He said the second greatest commandment is to love your neighbor as yourself. And the expert in the Torah responded, well, who is my neighbor? And according to the text, seeking to justify himself. And the response of Yeshua, Jesus, was he gave a parable of the Samaritan, the religious entity, or the religious community, I should say, that seemed different seems strange. We worship in Jerusalem. They worship over in that mountain in Samaria. And he told the story of the Good Samaritan who saw the Jewish person who was on the road and who was beaten. And he actually took them in and bandaged them and healed them. And then he asked, well, who was this person's neighbor? And the expert in the law said, well, the Samaritan was my neighbor. And the point of this goes back to the Torah. When, according to the story, Cain has slain his brother Abel, and the Lord asked him, where is your brother? And he says, am I my brother's keeper? Well, we must be our brother's keeper and our sister's keeper. I mean, we must realize that our brother and our sister is not defined by our creed. It's not defined by our ethnicity. It's not defined by our gender. It's not defined by our nationality. We are all our brother and sister's keeper. And again, this is one of the gifts of Judaism to the world. And this is why it's so important, I believe, for those of us who are in the non-Jewish community to make sure that we are standing in solidarity with our Jewish community, because there's so many deep and profound gifts that the Jewish community has given to the world. And it's these very values that we must uphold in standing against anti-Semitism, standing against racism, standing against xenophobia and other forms of hatred and bigotry in our world today.
Yes.
I have a story to tell you, short story, I hope. There is an East Indian lady born in Trinidad to Muslim parents. She is now, we're talking Winnipeg now, where she is now a grandmother at Our Lady of Perpetual Help Catholic Church. She is not ranked anywhere in the hierarchy, but with her priestly approval, usually 4 times a year, she collects over a dozen different faith groups together to share values and customs, and probably does more for world peace than the United Nations. Anyway, it's been my honor, privilege, whatever, for the last 15, 20 years or so, to pack a guitar there, some bad jokes and whatever's happening in the season from a Jewish perspective. Okay. I was asked by a minister of Kildonan United Church to come and present Judaism to his flock. He'd had other faith groups. I said, okay, let's call it Christianity's Jewish Roots with Music and Humor. I couldn't do it without the humor. Without the music, they'd fall asleep. Subsequently, half a dozen churches and 4 Jewish organizations have been presented to. It's also known as 4,000 Years of Judaism for, the Jewish community, so they could identify, and seems to be fairly well received all over the place. I'm wrestling to update the presentation on Zoom so I can inflict this on the rest of the world. And it's currently an hour and a quarter to do the whole thing, and I'm trying to get. I was asked, well, how do you get 4,000 years in an hour and a quarter? So I said, well, really, I take it from the beginning of time to today. I didn't want to leave anything out. But I hit the high points. The other half is, I would love to have a copy of your text there to go back over and digest a little more thoroughly than blowing through once.
Absolutely. And I'll sort of defer to Dr. Patterson. I believe that ISGAP has some means of archiving.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, and this has been recorded and will be very soon available on the ISGAP website, so you can play it and replay it. I do have one more question from Murray Rubin I want to get to while we have another minute or so. He wants to know, why don't the Black people who are looking for support publicize the words of Dr. Martin Luther King to the Jewish community?
I would, I'm not sure that I would agree with that assumption. I believe that the words of Dr. King are well publicized. I think what may be missing is the connections. We hear, of course, the African-American community, as we come into Black History Month, which I believe that every month is Black History Month, by the way. Just my plug. But anyway, Dr. King's words and message are abundantly promoted and replicated and embraced in the African community, the African-American community, and all communities. But I think the connection between the words of Dr. King and his drawing from Jewish heritage is something we need to do more of. But I would say to this questioner, visit an African-American church, and you'll get quite a bit of that during some of the civil rights, Black history events, and you probably will get quite a bit of the spiritual component to the civil rights movement and the words and work of Dr. King and other leaders in the civil rights community, because it was birthed out of the Black faith movement. And so those roots are there. Those roots are certainly embraced within our community. And I would just encourage you to connect more with it. If I can be a resource to you, feel free to reach out to me as well.
Ansel, I'm not sure with regard to American society and all of its diversity. My guess is that most Americans don't know the name of the mountain that's referenced in the mountaintop speech, or what it's referenced to exactly, or who's buried there.
That's right. That's right. No, I think you're right. And I think that might be a great presentation, maybe a docuseries or a paper. I think we could do something around that speech. It's powerful. It's powerful.
Absolutely.
It's deeply powerful in ways that people don't fully realize. And I think that's the spirit of the question. I think we need to maybe present the depth of what Dr. King presented for the African-American community, and it's drawing upon the Jewish story of sovereignty and birth in the Jewish homeland.
No,
as a
that
place
speech,
of promise of freedom. Yes.
That speech should be studied. And, it should be carefully read and explored and studied and discussed. Well, as you mentioned, that there are churches in the African-American community called Mount Nebo Church, named for that mountain.
That's right. Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely. And again, the African-American community, the African-American faith community always drew from the places and the names of the Jewish scriptures. Always, because there was a resonance. Yes.
Well, we are out of time, I'm afraid. This has been exciting, stimulating, educational. If you, Dr. Brown, if you looked in the chat, you know that you're already getting rave reviews, and
thank you.
Deeply appreciated by all of us. And let your friends know, have your friends take a look at the ISGAP website. This presentation is part of a series. And it's an outstanding series by top scholars in the world, like Dr. Ansel Brown. Thank you, Dr. Brown, and thank all of you.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you for having me. And please feel free to reach out if you have any further questions or would like to further converse on this important topic.
Yes. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Be safe. All blessings.
Thank you.